Several sources have confirmed to CBS News that this was a stabbing attack that happened at the prison where he is serving a decades-long sentence for sexually abusing young girls and women while he was a sports doctor at Michigan State University, but also with U.S. Gymnastics.
These prisoners walked out of the cell smiling. They had just done the unthinkable. Moments earlier, that same cell had become a slaughterhouse. Inside, a man lay bleeding, a man every other inmate despised. No one screamed for help. No one tried to stop it, because everyone knew what he was. When the guards arrived, the two killers were calm, almost proud. It wasn't rage that drove them. It was judgment, their own version of justice. Because in prison, even the worst men draw a line, and those who cross it never walk out alive. But this was just one story, a reminder that behind bars, the past never dies. And somewhere else, another predator was about to learn that same lesson in a far more chilling way. Larry Nassar. For years, Larry Nassar lived behind a mask of trust. He was the smiling doctor who promised gold medals, the man who stood beside America's best gymnasts, someone parents believed would protect their daughters. He was supposed to heal pain, not create it. Nassar began working with USA Gymnastics in the 1980s, later joining Michigan State University, where he treated hundreds of athletes. He was respected, celebrated, the kind of man who seemed untouchable. But behind the title of doctor hid one of the darkest secrets in sports history. Inside examination rooms, he claimed his treatments were legitimate medical procedures. In truth, they were sexual assaults. He used his position to manipulate young girls, Olympians, students, even children as young as 6. He told them it was part of therapy. He told them not to tell anyone, and when some tried, they were dismissed, silenced, or ignored. For over 20 years, Nassar used his credibility as a shield. He thrived inside a system that chose medals over morality and silence over truth. The abuse spread across teams, states, and generations, until one woman finally refused to stay quiet. Rachel Den Hollander became the first to speak his name publicly in 2016. Her courage cracked the illusion. Then, one by one, the others came forward. Olympic champions like Ali Reisman, Simone Biles, Michaela Maroney, and Jordan Weber revealed that they too had been victims. The courtroom that followed was unlike any in American history. Over 150 survivors stood before Nassar to face him directly, to reclaim their voices, their power, and their dignity. Some trembled, some stared him down. One survivor told him, "You used your power to break us. Now we're using ours to end you." When Judge Rosemary Aquilina spoke, the world fell silent. "I've just signed your death warrant." Nassar was sentenced to 175 years in prison, a lifetime behind bars, plus another. A sentence that said plainly, "You will never walk free again." But prison didn't end his story. It only changed the setting. In July 2023, at a Florida federal penitentiary, Nassar was attacked. An inmate ambushed him in the recreation yard, stabbing him repeatedly, 10 wounds to the chest, back, and neck. The argument that started it was about women's sports, but few believed that was the real reason. Inmates said it was karma. Others called it justice, the prison way. He survived, barely, and now lives under constant isolation. A doctor who once held power over hundreds now needs guards to protect him from everyone else. And inside those concrete walls, one truth echoes louder than any judge's sentence. Even behind bars, predators never stop paying for what they've done. Because sometimes, justice doesn't come from the law. Sometimes, it comes from those who've already broken it, just like the two inmates who smiled for the cameras moments after doing the unthinkable, Mahir Rahman. They smiled as they walked out of the cell, two inmates, calm and deliberate, glancing once at the CCTV camera before walking away. Moments earlier, that same cell had become a killing ground. Inside lay Mahir Rahman, a 29-year-old sex offender who had entered HMP Fosse Way thinking he could quietly serve his sentence. He never made it through his first year. Rahman's crimes had followed him in. He was convicted of sexual offenses that even other prisoners refused to tolerate. the kind of charges that instantly mark a man. In prison, your paperwork travels faster than you do. Before he'd even unpacked, everyone already knew what he was. He kept to himself, avoided eye contact, ate alone. But reputation has a scent, and in a closed world like Fosse Way, it never fades. The two inmates who shared the wing with him began to watch. They weren't friends, more like soldiers of a code that didn't need words. They didn't shout threats or start fights. They waited. On the morning of the attack, guards made their usual rounds. Nothing seemed out of place. Inside the cell, Abdul Rahman was cornered. The two men stepped in, closed the door, and in minutes, the quiet routine of prison life turned violent. Later, when investigators pieced together the CCTV, they saw fragments, the door shutting, silence, then movement. When it opened again, the killers walked out side by side. No panic, no hesitation. One of them even smirked directly at the lens. When officers entered, Abdul Rahman was on the floor, covered in blood, stabbed multiple times, and beaten so severely that paramedics couldn't save him. He died a few minutes later, surrounded not by loved ones, but by concrete and chaos. The killers were caught immediately. Their names were released in court, both already serving lengthy terms for violent crimes. During questioning, they spoke casually, no signs of guilt. One of them told investigators, "People like him don't get to live here." The other called it justice for the kids. When news of the murder hit national outlets, BBC, Sky News, The Guardian, the public reaction was divided. Some called it a disgrace, proof that Britain's newest rehabilitation-focused prison had failed. Others saw it differently, a brutal, primitive kind of justice that the legal system could never deliver. Social media lit up with a single phrase repeated again and again: "He got what he deserved." Inside the prison, the mood was colder. No one mourned Abdul Rahman. Even inmates who had nothing to do with the killing stayed silent, as if acknowledging that the rules had been followed. Because in places like Fosse Way, there's a hierarchy that no law book can rewrite. Murderers, drug dealers, armed robbers, they can walk the yard and earn respect. But child predators? They walk with fear, always looking over their shoulder, knowing one mistake could be their last. The security review that followed exposed the failure. Cameras working, guards nearby, but no one realizing what was happening until it was too late. It raised questions about how two men could plan and carry out a killing inside one of Britain's most modern facilities. But for the men on that wing, there was no mystery. Everyone knew why it happened, only not when. Months later, when the footage was shown in court, the image burned into the public mind. Two men leaving a cell, expressionless, calm, one of them almost smiling. That moment captured more than a murder. It captured a message. A reminder that in prison, justice doesn't always wear a uniform. Abdul Rahman's death became another entry in a long, grim pattern, predators entering prison alive and never walking out. His killers were sentenced again, adding years to lives they were already losing. And for many watching, it felt less like a crime and more like balance being restored. Because behind the steel doors and the layers of concrete, a different court exists. It has no judge, no jury, only a sentence that's carried out in silence. And for Mahir Abdul Rahman, that sentence came from two men who believed they were delivering justice on behalf of everyone else. In the end, there were no heroes, no redemption, only another dead man and two lives thrown deeper into darkness. But prison doesn't stop for that. The doors close again, the lights buzz back on, and the code continues. And somewhere else, in another cell, another predator was serving his own life sentence. A man whose crimes stretched far beyond one country and whose end would prove that even the walls of prison can't contain the weight of what he'd done. Richard Huckle. Some monsters don't hide in the dark. They blend into everyday life, polite, educated, and invisible. That was Richard Huckle. To the world, he was a young British man with a passion for photography and charity work. To those who trusted him, he was a volunteer, a teacher, a friend. But behind his camera, he was documenting something unspeakable. Between 2006 and 2014, Huckle traveled back and forth between the UK and Malaysia, presenting himself as a kind-hearted missionary. He told local families he wanted to help disadvantaged children to teach English, to give them a better future. But his real goal was far darker. He used his access to poor communities to exploit children, some as young as 6 months old. He gained the trust of families, offered to babysit, gave gifts, took photos, and when no one was watching, he committed acts that would make even hardened criminals turn away. Back in the UK, he uploaded thousands of illegal files to hidden parts of the internet, building a reputation among online predators. He even wrote a manual, a guide teaching others how to manipulate victims while avoiding detection. By 2014, British authorities and Interpol had been tracking online networks where his material surfaced. It took 2 years of international coordination before they found his real name. In 2016, when he landed at Gatwick Airport for Christmas, police were waiting. They found over 20,000 illegal files on his laptop and cameras, one of the largest archives ever recovered in the UK. The evidence was overwhelming. In court, Huckle pleaded guilty to 71 counts of serious offences against 23 known minors, though investigators believed there were dozens more. Many were minors from impoverished families who had trusted him completely. The judge called him a cold, calculating predator with no remorse. He was given 22 life sentences with a minimum of 25 years before parole, effectively ensuring he'd die in prison. But just 3 years into his sentence, that promise was fulfilled sooner than expected. On October 13, 2019, inside HMP Full Sutton, a high-security prison in Yorkshire, Huckle was found dead in his cell. He had been attacked by another inmate, Paul Fitzgerald, a convicted killer who said he wanted to make Huckle feel what his victims felt. The weapon was a handmade blade, sharpened from a toothbrush and wrapped in plastic. The attack was brutal and personal. Fitzgerald assaulted him for almost an hour before killing him. When he was arrested, Fitzgerald didn't deny it. He told officers exactly why he did it. He said it was justice for the kids. In court, the details were so graphic that parts were redacted from public record. The judge described it as one of the most violent killings ever seen inside a British prison. Fitzgerald was convicted of murder and sentenced to serve a minimum of 34 years, though even he admitted that he didn't regret it. When news of Huckle's death spread, the reaction was eerily similar to that of Mahir Rahman's. Public opinion didn't mourn him. Instead, many called it the natural order, the inevitable fate of a man whose crimes defied all understanding. Headlines described his death as revenge from within. On social media, people said things they couldn't say in court, that sometimes prison delivers a justice system of its own. But beneath the noise, one truth stood out. Huckle's crimes weren't random. They were systematic, global, and carefully hidden by privilege. He moved through society like a ghost, committing horrors that spanned continents. And when the system finally caught him, it was the very world he entered, prison, that finished what the courts began. Because in the hierarchy of evil, even behind bars there are limits. And Richard Huckle crossed every single one. His death didn't erase his crimes, nor heal the damage he caused. But it sent a message that echoed through the cells of every prison in Britain, that even monsters eventually face monsters of their own. And as that story closed, another was already unfolding, one that reached back decades to a man of faith who used the church as his weapon, a priest whose crimes shocked the world. John Geoghan. For decades he wore the collar of trust, a priest, a guide, a man of God. But behind the pulpit, Father John Geoghan was something else entirely, a predator hiding behind faith. He began his ministry in the 1950s, serving parishes across Massachusetts. To his congregation, he was gentle and compassionate, especially with minors. He baptized babies, led youth groups, and visited families in need. Parents saw him as a blessing. Minors saw him as safe. But those same minors would later tell stories that stripped away every illusion of holiness. For more than 3 decades, Geoghan abused over 130 confirmed minors. He targeted broken homes, single mothers, and poor families, choosing those who wouldn't question a priest. He used blessings as cover, prayers as weapons, and the church's silence as his shield. Victims described how he gained their trust with small gifts and praise, how he manipulated their faith to control them, and when complaints finally reached church leaders, the response wasn't justice, it was concealment. The Archdiocese of Boston quietly transferred Geoghan from one parish to another. Each time, new families welcomed him, unaware of the trail he left behind. Over the years, internal memos, later revealed in court, showed that church officials knew. They simply chose to protect the institution instead of the children. By the time the truth surfaced in the late 1990s, the damage was beyond measure. The Boston Globe's Spotlight investigation exposed not only Geoghan's crimes, but a pattern of cover-ups across the Catholic Church. The world finally saw how an entire system had protected predators under the banner of faith. In 2002, Geoghan was convicted of indecent assault and battery on a 10-year-old boy and sentenced to 9 to 10 years in prison. For a man once called father, the title meant nothing now. Inside prison, everyone knew who he was. His name, his crimes, his victims, all carved into public record. There's no hiding from that kind of sin. Inmates don't forget men like John Geoghan, and in August 2003, just a year after he arrived at Sousa Baranowski Correctional Center, he paid the final price. His killer was Joseph Druce, a fellow inmate already serving a life sentence for murder. According to reports, Druce meticulously planned the attack. He jammed the cell door shut with magazines and cardboard, trapping guards on the outside. Then he strangled Geoghan with a bedsheet, stomped on him, and left him lifeless on the floor. It lasted minutes, long enough for every man on that block to know what was happening. When guards finally forced the door open, Druce was standing over the body. He told them he killed Geoghan for all the victims. He said men like him didn't deserve protection, even in prison. The death sent shockwaves through the church. For years, priests had been accused but rarely punished. Now one of the most notorious among them was dead, not by divine justice, but by the hands of another sinner. And for many survivors, it felt like a cruel, ironic kind of closure. Outside the prison, reactions split the same way they always do. Some called it barbaric, that no man, not even a predator, deserved to die that way. Others said it was simply justice catching up. But inside Sousa Baranowski, nobody shed a tear. The priest who preached forgiveness died with none given to him. His murder became symbolic, a physical manifestation of the rage that had built up for decades. It wasn't redemption, and it didn't erase the suffering he caused, but it proved one thing. Even within stone walls, the echoes of what a man has done follow him until the very end. Because titles fade, faith crumbles, and power disappears. And in the silence of a locked cell, all that remains is truth, and the judgment of those who have nothing left to lose. But the story doesn't stop here, because even after the fall of a priest, another figure, a man of fame, not faith, would soon face the same rule. A man whose voice once filled arenas, now trapped in a place where no one listens, and his reckoning was about to begin. Ian Watkins. He was a rock star, the face of a platinum-selling band, adored by millions. From sold-out arenas to magazine covers, Ian Watkins, frontman of Lost Prophets, lived a life built on fame, charm, and deception. But behind the music, behind the lights, was one of the darkest stories in the history of British rock. For years, Watkins used his fame to groom and manipulate fans, women who trusted him, and even mothers who let him near their children. He wasn't just a predator, he was a manipulator who weaponized celebrity. Online, he built secret networks, shared disturbing fantasies, and recorded acts too vile to describe. When police finally raided his home in 2012, what they found left investigators shaken. Thousands of explicit images, videos, and chat logs documenting abuse that went far beyond what anyone imagined. He had been planning crimes involving children, with others who followed him blindly. The arrest made headlines around the world. In court, Watkins pleaded guilty to 13 counts of sexual offenses, including the attempted rape of a baby. The judge called it one of the most shocking and harrowing cases ever seen. He was sentenced in 2013 to 29 years in prison, plus 6 more on extended license. For a man who once stood above crowds, he now spent his days alone, locked away in HMP Wakefield, one of Britain's toughest prisons, known among inmates as Monster Mansion. And inside those walls, his reputation followed him like a curse. Inmates whispered his name with disgust. To them, he was worse than a murderer. He lived in near total isolation, surrounded by guards who knew that if he ever stepped into the wrong wing, it would be over. Then, in August 2023, the inevitable happened. Watkins was attacked by 3 inmates, stabbed and beaten inside his cell. Reports said they held him hostage for hours before guards broke in. By the time they reached him, he was barely conscious, bleeding heavily. He survived, but the damage was permanent, both physical and psychological. The attack left him with multiple injuries and forced the prison to move him to a secure hospital wing for his own safety. Even behind bars, safety for Ian Watkins doesn't really exist. For the public, it felt like the scales tipping again, another predator meeting his own version of justice. Because in Wakefield, where some of the UK's worst killers serve their time, there's one rule that never changes: hurt the innocent and no one will mourn you. And while Watkins recovered under heavy guard, another inmate in another prison would never get that chance. His story ended quietly. A man found dead in his cell, his past finally catching up to him. Robert E. Cole. He wasn't a celebrity, he wasn't famous or powerful, but Robert E. Cole carried the same darkness that tied all these men together. For years, Cole worked as a volleyball coach in California. To his players and their parents, he was friendly, helpful, someone who wanted kids to succeed. He organized tournaments, volunteered at schools, and built a reputation that hid what he truly was. Behind that image, Cole was a predator. He used trust as his weapon, grooming young athletes, exploiting their dreams, and crossing lines that should never be crossed. By the time the truth came out, dozens of lives had already been scarred. In 2017, he was arrested and later convicted of child molestation and sexual abuse. The courtroom testimony was chilling, parents describing the betrayal, victims describing years of silence. Cole received a lengthy prison sentence and was transferred to Mule Creek State Prison, a facility already known for housing violent offenders and sex criminals. He arrived there as just another inmate, but everyone knew his file. In prison, word travels fast, and once you're labeled a predator, the clock starts ticking. On April 12, 2025, guards making their morning rounds found Cole dead in his cell. At first, it looked like another medical emergency. But when they examined the scene, the truth was clear. It was a suspected homicide. His cellmate, a man serving time for murder, was immediately placed under investigation. The details of the killing weren't released publicly, but insiders at Mule Creek said the attack was brutal, silent, quick, and deliberate. There were no witnesses, no shouts, no alarms, just another night where the past caught up to a man who couldn't outrun it. For the public, Cole's death barely made headlines. No viral outrage, no protests, just a few local reports confirming another sex offender had been killed in prison. It was almost routine. Another quiet reminder that behind those concrete walls, justice has many faces. Even among criminals, there's an understanding. You can be a killer, a thief, a gang member, and still walk the yard. But touch a child, and you're already living on borrowed time. Cole's death didn't shake the system. It didn't lead to reforms or investigations that lasted long. But inside those cells, every predator who heard the news understood what it meant. Because in prisons across the world, stories like his travel fast, faster than any guard can stop them. He went to prison to serve a sentence. He left it in a body bag. And in the end, his name joined a growing list. Men who thought their punishment ended with conviction, only to learn that justice inside works by its own rules. But as one door closed at Mule Creek, another was already opening in Australia, where one inmate decided he wouldn't wait for the system at all. To him, killing his cellmate wasn't a crime. It was doing the world a favor. Anthony Peden. By the time Anthony Peden entered prison, he already knew what was waiting for him. A man convicted of sexually abusing children doesn't just serve time. He serves a sentence of fear. Every step, every glance, every silence in the hallway reminds him that he's not like the others. Peden was an Australian child sex offender serving time at Woolston Correctional Centre, a facility near Brisbane. The prison was notorious, not for its size or design, but for its reputation. It was where the system sent those considered too dangerous or despised to mix with the general population. Inside those walls, predators lived on borrowed time. Peden was serving a long sentence for abusing children, a crime that branded him instantly. He tried to keep to himself, staying quiet, avoiding eye contact, eating alone. But isolation only goes so far when everyone around you knows what you did. In 2017, Peden was placed in a shared cell with another inmate, Trevor Huckle, a man convicted of killing a taxi driver years earlier. Huckle wasn't a man who talked much, but among inmates, he had a reputation for drawing lines and crossing them when he chose. On a quiet night in that cell, something broke. Maybe it was a word, a look, or maybe it was nothing at all. But when the guards made their rounds the next morning, Peden wasn't moving. He had been strangled and beaten to death. When they asked Huckle why he did it, his answer was cold, simple, and unforgettable. "I did the world a favor." The words spread fast through Woolston, whispered on the yard, repeated by guards, passed through corridors like a legend. To some inmates, Huckle became a kind of vigilante, a man who acted out the justice they all believed in but couldn't deliver. To others, he was just another killer who found an easy target. The investigation confirmed what everyone already knew. Peden had been murdered in his cell, and Huckle had confessed without hesitation. The act was deliberate, planned, and motivated by what Huckle called moral disgust. He didn't try to hide it. He didn't ask for leniency. He simply said he couldn't stand to breathe the same air as a man like that. In court, the judge asked him if he felt remorse. Huckle shook his head. He said he slept better now. The story ran across Australian media, picked up by ABC News and local outlets. The details were chilling, but what caught people most was the sentiment, the idea that, inside prison, the lines between villain and vigilante can blur until they're one and the same. Peden's death added another entry to a long, grim list. Predators who thought they could outlast the storm, only to find it waiting for them behind bars. His name faded fast, forgotten outside the prison walls. But among inmates, his story became a warning, the kind you don't need to write down. Because in that world, there's no parole from reputation. Once you're marked, you carry it until someone decides to erase it. And as the years passed and cells filled with new faces, another name was whispered through prison halls. A man whose crimes stretched across decades, whose victims numbered many, and whose death would be greeted not with mourning, but relief. Peter Tobin. By the time Peter Tobin took his last breath, no one wept. No tributes, no prayers, no headlines calling him misunderstood. Just silence. Because for decades, Tobin had been the face of something truly monstrous. He wasn't just a predator, he was a killer, a man who stalked, raped, and murdered women across the United Kingdom. His story began long before most of his victims were even born. In the 1960s, he already had a record of violence and manipulation. He was charming when he needed to be, cruel when he wanted to be, and invisible when it mattered most. In the 1990s, his mask finally slipped. Tobin murdered Angelica Kluck, a 23-year-old student who worked at a Glasgow church. Her body was found buried beneath the floorboards of the chapel, a place she thought was safe. That discovery reopened old wounds, and detectives began to connect dots stretching back years. In the garden of one of Tobin's former homes, police uncovered the remains of two teenage girls, Vicky Hamilton, who vanished in 1991, and Dinah McNichol, missing since the same year. Both had been abducted, murdered, and buried in shallow graves, hidden under his own home as if he'd buried the truth with them. By the time he was convicted, Tobin was already an old man. He received 3 life sentences for the murders, though investigators suspected he'd killed more. He was linked to several other disappearances and was even considered a possible suspect in the Bible John murders, one of Scotland's most infamous cold cases. In prison, Tobin never confessed, never apologized, never cooperated. He spent his days isolated, aging, and increasingly frail. But even as his body broke down, his name carried weight, not of fear, but of hatred. Other inmates spat on his food trays, refused to speak to him, and made it clear that no one would defend him if something happened. And something did. Over the years, Tobin was attacked multiple times, punched, slashed, and beaten. He was kept under near constant protection, not because anyone cared for him, but because no one wanted the paperwork that would follow his death. He lived long enough to become irrelevant, a ghost in a place built for monsters. When Tobin died in October 2022, the news barely made a ripple. Guards later said not a single inmate mourned him. One of them told reporters, "It's the only good news he ever gave us." For once, the world agreed. There were no vigils, no flowers, just quiet satisfaction that one more predator was gone. Peter Tobin's death marked more than the end of a life. It marked the end of an era, of a generation of men who believed they could hide behind charm, faith, or fame. But as these stories have shown, the past never stays buried, not for men like Tobin, not for any of them. Because inside every prison, behind every locked door, there's a code that never fades. You can escape justice for a while, but sooner or later justice finds you.